Margaret Maggie Sullivan had been awake since 3 a.m., watching the darkness outside her bedroom window slowly give way to the gray light of dawn. At 78 years old, she rarely slept well anymore, but today was different. Today, nervous energy coursed through her veins like electricity, making her feel 20 years younger and simultaneously reminding her of every single one of her 78 years. Her daughter Linda had called 3 times the previous evening, each call more frantic than the last. "Mom, you can't do this. The doctor said your blood pressure." "I'm going, Linda." "But traveling alone at your age, across the country." "I'm going." "Mom, please be reasonable. I'll video call you during the ceremony. You can watch from home." Maggie had hung up on her own daughter for the first time in her life. Now sitting in Gate C7 at Missoula, Montana Airport, Maggie clutched her boarding pass like it might disintegrate if she loosened her grip. The paper trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a tremor that had developed in her hands over the past decade. She hated that tremor. It made her feel weak, fragile, old. She was wearing her best floral dress, the one she'd bought for Linda's wedding 15 years ago. Long sleeves despite it being August. A cream-colored cardigan draped over her shoulders. Sensible shoes. Her silver hair was set in the same style she'd worn since 1965. To anyone looking at her, she was just another elderly woman, probably traveling to see grandchildren, probably needing assistance boarding the plane. No one could see the storm inside her. "Excuse me, ma'am, is this seat taken?" Maggie looked up to see a young Marine in his dress blues, crisp and perfect, standing beside the empty chair next to her. He couldn't have been more than 22, with a fresh haircut and nervous eyes that suggested this might be one of his first flights in uniform. "No, go ahead," Maggie said softly. The young man sat down carefully, adjusting his uniform. Maggie found herself staring at him, at the eagle, globe, and anchor on his cover, at the precise creases in his trousers, at the way he sat with his back ramrod straight even in an airport chair. The Marine noticed her looking and offered a polite smile. "First time seeing a Marine up close, ma'am." Something flickered across Maggie's face, an expression so fleeting the young man almost missed it. Her lips curled into a smile that seemed to hold secrets. "Not exactly," she whispered. Before he could ask what she meant, Maggie reached into her worn leather purse. Her trembling fingers found what they were looking for, a photograph, protected in a small plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. She pulled it out and stared at it. The Marine leaned slightly closer, curious despite himself. The photograph was so faded it was nearly impossible to make out details. The black and white had deteriorated to shades of gray and brown, but if you looked closely, really closely, you could see a group of women in military uniforms standing in formation. The date scrawled on the back in pencil read, "Camp Pendleton, 1953. "Ma'am, is that Flight 2847 to Charlotte, now boarding all zones." The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom. Maggie tucked the photograph back into her purse with surprising speed, as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. She stood, steadier than her age suggested she should be, and gathered her small carry-on bag. The young Marine stood as well, trained to show respect to his elders. "Are you traveling to see family, ma'am?" "My grandson," Maggie said, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. "He's graduating from Paris Island tomorrow." The Marine's entire demeanor changed. His eyes lit up with recognition and pride. "No kidding. He made it through boot camp. That's outstanding, ma'am. You must be incredibly proud." "I am," Maggie said simply. Then she paused, looking at this young man in his uniform, and added something she hadn't planned to say. "He doesn't really know me, not the real me. Nobody does." The Marine looked confused, but before he could respond, Maggie was already walking toward the boarding line, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders despite the warm airport terminal. He watched her go, this mysterious elderly woman with her faded photograph and cryptic words, and wondered what she'd meant. On the plane, Maggie settled into her window seat in row 23. A middle-aged businessman took the aisle seat, immediately plugging in headphones and opening his laptop. He didn't acknowledge her existence. She preferred it that way. As the plane taxied down the runway, Maggie did something she hadn't done in 50 years. When the flight attendant came by with the beverage cart, Maggie ordered whiskey. Straight. The businessman glanced at her with mild surprise but said nothing. Maggie held the small plastic cup in both hands, staring at the amber liquid. The last time she'd had whiskey was in 1954, the night before her discharge from the Marine Corps. She and 3 other women from her unit had snuck off base to a bar that barely tolerated their presence. They'd toasted to their service, to their futures, to the hope that someone, someday, would remember what they'd done. None of those women were alive anymore. Maggie had outlived them all. She took a sip. The whiskey burned just like she remembered. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Maggie pressed her forehead against the cool window and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would see Jake graduate. Tomorrow, he would become a Marine, joining a brotherhood that had once included her, even if the brotherhood had never fully acknowledged it. Her left shoulder ached. It always did when it rained or when she was stressed. Beneath the floral dress, beneath the cardigan, beneath 7 decades of silence, the tattoo waited. The ink had faded, but the meaning never had. Margaret Sullivan was flying toward a reckoning she didn't fully understand yet. But somewhere deep in her bones, in the part of her that still stood at attention when she heard the Marine Corps hymn, she knew that this trip would change everything. The woman no one really knew was about to be seen. Maggie's hotel room in Beaufort, South Carolina was small and smelled faintly of bleach and air freshener. She arrived just after midnight, exhausted from the connecting flight in Charlotte and the taxi ride through the humid southern night. But sleep wouldn't come. At 2 a.m. she gave up trying. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, silver hair, lined face, eyes that had seen too much and said too little. Slowly, as if performing a sacred ritual she'd done 1,000 times before, Maggie stood and walked to the bathroom. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered before stabilizing into harsh brightness. Maggie locked the door, an old habit, even though she was completely alone. With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned her nightgown and let it fall to her waist. There it was. Her left shoulder, wrinkled and spotted with age, bore the mark she'd hidden for 70 years. The tattoo was barely visible now. The black ink had faded to a grayish blue, bleeding slightly into the surrounding skin. But if you knew what you were looking for, you could still make it out. The eagle, globe, and anchor emblem of the Marine Corps, modified with the distinct features of the women Marines. Beneath it, the dates, 1952-1954, in small, precise numbers. And below that, almost invisible now, 3 initials in script, JRM. Maggie traced the outline with her index finger, following the familiar path she'd memorized decades ago. She remembered the tattoo parlor in Oceanside, California, a grimy little shop that smelled of cigarettes and ink. It was March 1954, 3 days before her discharge. The tattoo artist had been an old Navy man, arms covered in faded anchors and pin-up girls. When she'd walked in and pointed to the women Marines emblem on the wall, he'd laughed. "Ladies don't get tattoos, sweetheart. How about a nice flower, a butterfly?" Maggie had been 24 years old and angrier than she'd ever been in her life. She was being forced out of the service she loved because the war was over and women weren't needed anymore. She'd slapped a $20 bill on the counter, more money than she should have spent. "Marines do," she'd said, her voice ice cold, "and I'm a Marine." The old man had studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose you are." Now standing in a cheap hotel bathroom 7 decades later, Maggie wondered if he'd understood what he was giving her. This tattoo wasn't decoration. It was proof, evidence, a permanent record on her own skin that she had existed, that she had served, that she had mattered. Even if the world had decided to forget. She rebuttoned her nightgown and returned to bed, but her mind was racing. At 3:30 a.m. her phone rang. It was Jake, calling from the barracks at Paris Island. "Grandma," his voice was barely a whisper. "Did I wake you?" "No, sweetheart, I'm awake. Are you okay?" She heard him take a shaky breath. "I'm terrified, Grandma. Tomorrow. What if I mess up during the ceremony? What if I'm not good enough? What if I don't deserve this?" Maggie's entire body went rigid. She knew that feeling, that crushing self-doubt, that fear of being exposed as unworthy. She'd felt it every single day of her service. "Jacob Michael Sullivan, you listen to me." Her voice transformed, becoming stronger, harder, carrying an authority she rarely let anyone hear. "You are good enough. You made it through 13 weeks of the hardest training in the world. You earned the title. You're a Marine now. That means something." "How do you know, Grandma? You've never been through anything like this." The lie sat between them in the silence. "I just know," Maggie said softly. "Trust me on this. You belong there." After they hung up, Maggie whispered to the empty room, "I should know. I've been lying about belonging somewhere for 70 years. The next morning dawned brutally hot. By 8 a.m., the temperature was already approaching 90 degrees, and the humidity made the air feel thick enough to swim through. Maggie dressed carefully in her floral dress, long sleeves, despite the heat, and her cream cardigan. She studied herself in the mirror, making absolutely certain that no part of her left shoulder was visible. The taxi driver who took her to Paris Island was a chatty local who pointed out landmarks along the way. Maggie barely heard him. Her heart was pounding so hard she wondered if she might be having a heart attack. The Marine Corps recruit depot at Paris Island was imposing: gates, guards, monuments to valor and sacrifice. As her taxi passed through the entrance, Maggie felt something shift inside her chest. She was back, not at Camp Pendleton where she'd served, but in a Marine Corps space. The air even smelled the same, a combination of salt water, cut grass, and something indefinable that only existed on military bases. The parade deck was already filling with families when Maggie arrived at 9:30 a.m. Folding chairs had been set up in neat rows facing a raised platform. American flags snapped in the breeze. Drill instructors in their distinctive smoky bear hats moved through the crowd with purpose. Maggie found her assigned seat in the third row and sat down carefully, adjusting her cardigan to make sure it covered her shoulders completely. The woman next to her was younger, maybe in her 50s, wearing a proud Marine mom t-shirt and fanning herself with a program. "Lord have mercy, it's hot," the woman said, smiling at Maggie. "Is this your first Marine graduation?" Maggie hesitated. "My grandson is graduating today." "How wonderful! My son is in Lima Company. Which company is your grandson in?" "Kilo Company." The woman beamed and continued talking about her son, about how proud she was, about how she'd sent care packages every week. Maggie smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, but her mind was elsewhere. She was remembering another ceremony, 71 years ago, her own graduation from basic training at Camp Lejeune. There had been no families present. Women's training wasn't considered important enough for a big ceremony. Just 23 women in ill-fitting uniforms, taking an oath that would bind them to something larger than themselves. Maggie had believed in that oath with every fiber of her being. "Honey, you really should take off that cardigan," the woman next to her said, interrupting Maggie's thoughts. "You're going to get heat stroke. Here, use my program to fan yourself." "I'm fine, thank you," Maggie said, pulling the sleeves down even further. At 10 a.m. sharp, the ceremony began. A brass band started playing, and the sound of hundreds of boots marching in perfect unison filled the air. Company after company of new Marines marched onto the parade deck in their dress blues, moving as one organism. The precision was breathtaking. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Then Commander Robert Chen took the stage. He was an imposing figure, at least 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and steel-gray hair at his temples. His uniform was immaculate, his chest covered in ribbons that spoke of decades of service and sacrifice. When he spoke, his voice carried across the parade deck with natural authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, families and friends, welcome to Paris Island. Today, we gather to witness the transformation of civilians into United States Marines." Maggie's hand instinctively moved to her left shoulder, pressing against the fabric of her dress. Beneath it, she could feel the faint raised lines of the old tattoo. Commander Chen continued, "These young men and women have earned the title through sacrifice, through perseverance, through embracing the legacy of those who came before them. They stand on the shoulders of generations of Marines who have defended this nation since 1775. A single tear rolled down Maggie's cheek. She was one of those who came before, one of the forgotten ones, one of the erased. But she was here, still standing, still carrying the mark of what she'd been, even if she'd spent a lifetime hiding it. Commander Chen's words echoed across the parade deck. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Maggie closed her eyes and whispered so quietly that no one could hear. Always. Ceremony unfolded with military precision. Company after company was called forward, each group of new Marines standing at perfect attention as their accomplishments were recognized. Maggie's eyes scanned the sea of dress blues, searching desperately for Jake's face among the hundreds of identical uniforms. When Kilo Company was finally called, her heart nearly stopped. There he was, third row, fourth from the left. Jake Sullivan, the boy who used to cry when she read him bedtime stories, the teenager who'd struggled with math homework at her kitchen table, now standing tall in Marine Corps dress blues. His cover sat at the precise angle, his white gloves were spotless, and his face was set in an expression of fierce concentration. He looked nothing like the grandson she knew. He looked like a warrior. Maggie's hands gripped the edges of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. The woman next to her noticed and patted her arm sympathetically. "It's overwhelming, isn't it, seeing them like this?" "Yes," Maggie managed to whisper, It's everything." But what she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that she wasn't just seeing her grandson. She was seeing herself, 71 years ago, standing in formation at Camp Lejeune. She was feeling the weight of the uniform, the pride of earning the title, the certainty that she was part of something eternal and important. She was remembering what it felt like to belong. Commander Chen presented the honors, calling out the names of distinguished graduates. Jake wasn't among them, but Maggie didn't care. He'd made it. He'd survived. He was a Marine. That was enough. That was everything. The ceremony concluded with the Marine Corps hymn. Everyone stood. Maggie's body moved on instinct, her posture straightening in a way that made the woman next to her glance at her with surprise. As the familiar words echoed across the parade deck, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, Maggie's lips moved silently, singing along with every word she'd memorized in 1952. Then it was over. The new Marines were released to find their families. The parade deck transformed into controlled chaos as hundreds of people surged forward. Maggie stood on her toes, trying to spot Jake in the crowd. The South Carolina heat pressed down on her like a physical weight. Sweat trickled down her back beneath the cardigan. Her vision swam slightly. "Grandma." She turned to see Jake pushing through the crowd, his face split in the widest smile she'd ever seen. He reached her and, without hesitation, lifted her off her feet in a bear hug. Maggie laughed and cried simultaneously, clutching his uniform with both hands. "Look at you. Oh, Jake, look at you." When he set her down, they both had tears streaming down their faces. Jake's battle buddy, a young Hispanic Marine with Rodriguez on his name tape, stood nearby with his own family, grinning at the reunion. "I can't believe you came," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom said you weren't feeling well, that the trip would be too much." "Your mother worries too much," Maggie said firmly. "There was no force on earth that could keep me from being here today." Jake introduced her to Rodriguez and his family, to his drill instructor, a stern-faced man who softened slightly when shaking hands with families, and to several other Marines from his platoon. Maggie shook every hand, smiled at every introduction, and felt the cardigan growing heavier with sweat. The temperature had climbed past 95 degrees. The humidity made breathing feel like work. Other families were shedding jackets and moving to shaded areas, but Maggie kept her cardigan on, kept her arms covered, kept her secret hidden. "Grandma, you look pale," Jake said suddenly, his joy shifting to concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart, just happy." "You're sweating through your dress. Here, let's get you some water." He started to guide her toward a refreshment table, but Maggie stumbled slightly. Jake caught her immediately. Rodriguez was there in an instant, his Marine training kicking in. "Ma'am, you need to sit down," Rodriguez said firmly. "You're overheating." They guided her to a bench in a small patch of shade. Another Marine materialized with a bottle of cold water and ice pack. Jake knelt in front of her, fear evident in his eyes. "Grandma, please, take off the cardigan. You're going to pass out." "I'm fine," Maggie insisted, but her voice was weak. The world tilted slightly. "Ma'am, with respect, you're not fine," Rodriguez said. He'd already assessed her condition: flushed face, rapid breathing, trembling hands, classic heat exhaustion. "We need to cool you down, now." Before Maggie could protest, Rodriguez gently helped her slip the cardigan off her shoulders. The relief was immediate. Cool air touched her overheated skin, but with the relief came exposure. A passing Marine officer, a captain, stopped mid-stride. He stared at Maggie's left shoulder, his eyes widening. Then he turned to a nearby corporal. "Go get the commander, right now." Jake focused on his grandmother's face, pressed the ice pack to her neck. "Just breathe, Grandma, slow breaths." But Rodriguez had followed the captain's gaze. He was staring at Maggie's shoulder, at the faded tattoo that was now visible in the bright sunlight. His expression shifted from concern to absolute shock. Sullivan," Rodriguez said quietly, "your grandmother, is that?" Jake finally looked where Rodriguez was pointing. He saw his grandmother's bare shoulder for the first time in his life. Time seemed to stop. There, etched into his 78-year-old grandmother's skin, was a tattoo. Not just any tattoo, the eagle, globe, and anchor. The Women Marines emblem, dates from the 1950s, initials he didn't recognize. Jake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Maggie saw his expression and knew. After 70 years, the secret was out. Her hand moved instinctively to cover the tattoo, but it was too late. Other Marines were stopping now, staring, pointing. Word was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Within 90 seconds, a small crowd had formed around the bench. Marines of all ranks stood in a semicircle, their eyes fixed on the elderly woman with the faded military tattoo. And somewhere in the crowd, Commander Chen was pushing his way forward, having been told something impossible. There was a Korean War-era woman Marine sitting on the parade deck. And nobody had known she was there. Commander Robert Chen was halfway to his car when his aide, Lieutenant Morrison, came sprinting across the parking lot with an urgency that stopped Chen in his tracks. "Sir," Morrison was out of breath. "Sir, you need to come back to the parade deck." Chen turned, irritated. The ceremony had gone perfectly, he'd completed his duties, and he had mountains of paperwork waiting in his office. "Lieutenant, unless someone's bleeding or the base is under attack." "There's a woman, sir, an elderly woman. She has a tattoo. A Women Marines tattoo from the Korean War era." Chen's irritation evaporated instantly. "What?" Captain Martinez saw it. He's not sure, but he thinks it's authentic. Sir, if it is. Morrison didn't need to finish the sentence. Chen was already walking back toward the parade deck, his stride purposeful. Morrison struggled to keep up. As they approached, Chen could see the crowd, at least 20 Marines in a semicircle around a bench, standing at an informal attention. The crowd parted as he approached, Marines stepping aside for their commander. And there she was. An elderly woman, small and fragile-looking, sitting on a bench with an ice pack pressed to her neck. Her floral dress was soaked with sweat. A young Marine, clearly a new graduate, knelt beside her, holding her hand, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. Another young Marine stood nearby with a cardigan draped over his arm. But Chen's eyes went immediately to her left shoulder. He stopped walking, just stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. The tattoo was faded almost to the point of invisibility, but Chen had been in the Marine Corps for 25 years. He knew what he was looking at. The eagle, globe, and anchor with the distinct Women Marines modification. The dates, 1952-1954, and beneath it, barely visible, 3 initials in faded script. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. Chen had seen thousands of military tattoos in his career, on drill instructors, on combat veterans, on Marines young and old. But he had never, not once, seen a women Marines tattoo from the Korean War era. Because most of those women were gone, and the ones who remained had been forgotten. The young Marine kneeling by the bench looked up at Chen with desperate eyes. "Sir, she's overheating. We've got water and ice, but I think she might need medical." "I'm fine," the elderly woman said sharply, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. "Stop fussing over me, Jacob." Chen moved closer slowly, as if approaching something sacred. He knelt down beside the bench, bringing himself to eye level with the woman. Up close, he could see the strength in her face beneath the age and exhaustion. Her eyes were clear, intelligent, and deeply afraid. "Ma'am," Chen said gently, "my name is Commander Robert Chen. May I ask yours?" The woman's jaw tightened. "Margaret Sullivan." "Mrs. Sullivan." Chen's eyes moved to her shoulder again. "That tattoo, is it real?" The question hung in the humid air. 20 Marines held their breath. The young man, Jacob, looked from his grandmother to the commander and back again, clearly lost. Maggie closed her eyes. For a moment, Chen thought she might faint, but when she opened them again, there was something different in her expression. Something that had been buried for 70 years was clawing its way to the surface. "Yes, Commander," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's real." The parade deck seemed to tilt beneath Jake's feet. "Grandma, what? What does that mean? You have a Marine Corps tattoo. How?" Maggie looked at her grandson and her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Jake. I should have told you. I should have told everyone, but I couldn't." "Ma'am," Chen said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of understanding, "were you a Marine?" The word hung between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Maggie's hands were shaking violently now, but not from heat exhaustion. Yes, I was. I served from 1952 to 1954, Camp Pendleton. I was a clerk in the casualty section." Jake made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You were a Marine. My grandmother was a Marine for 2 years, and you never told us." "Who would have cared?" Maggie's voice cracked. "When I came home in 1954, nobody wanted to hear about women in the service. I applied for jobs and they laughed, told me I had no real work experience. I went to one veterans meeting and the men there, they treated me like I'd been playing dress-up, like what I did didn't matter, like I didn't matter." Her breath was coming in short gasps now, but she couldn't stop talking. 70 years of silence was breaking like a dam. "So I took off my uniform and I hid this tattoo and I never spoke about it again. I got married. I raised children. I built a life where nobody knew, because it was easier to disappear than to keep fighting to be seen." Chen felt something burning in his chest, anger, sadness, shame. He knew this story. He'd read the statistics. Over 20,000 women had served during the Korean War, and most of them had been erased from history, their service unacknowledged, their sacrifices forgotten. "Ma'am," Chen said, his voice rough with emotion, "what you did, processing casualty reports, that's one of the hardest jobs in the Corps. You bore witness to every sacrifice. You honored the fallen with your work." Maggie shook her head. "I just typed letters, that's all." "No," Chen said firmly. He slowly, deliberately came to attention. And then, in front of 20 Marines and dozens of confused family members, Commander Robert Chen rendered a crisp salute to a 78-year-old woman in a sweat-soaked floral dress. "Marine," he said, his voice carrying across the parade deck, "thank you for your service." Maggie's entire body went rigid. Muscle memory from 7 decades ago took over. Despite her age, despite her exhaustion, despite everything, she straightened her posture and returned the salute with trembling precision. Around them, every Marine within sight snapped to attention and saluted. The parade deck fell absolutely silent. And Margaret Sullivan, who had hidden her service for 70 years, who had convinced herself she didn't matter, who had lived in the shadows of her own history, broke down and wept. The salute seemed to last forever and no time at all. When Commander Chen finally dropped his hand, the silence on the parade deck was so complete that Maggie could hear the flag snapping in the breeze overhead. She couldn't stop crying. 70 years of buried emotion was flooding out of her: grief, pride, anger, relief, shame, and something else she couldn't quite name. Her chest heaved with sobs she'd held back for 7 decades. Jake was beside her in an instant, wrapping his arms around her fragile shoulders. "Grandma, I've got you. I've got you." But Chen wasn't finished. He turned to the crowd of Marines and family members that had gathered. "Listen up." His command voice cut through the murmur of confused conversations. "This woman is Marine Corporal Margaret Sullivan, retired. She served from 1952 to 1954 during the Korean War, and until 5 minutes ago, nobody knew." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. More Marines were approaching now, drawn by the commotion. Senior officers, drill instructors, young Marines still fresh from graduation, all gathering around this elderly woman on a bench. Chen looked back at Maggie. "Ma'am, you said you worked in the casualty section at Camp Pendleton. What exactly did you do?" Maggie wiped her eyes with trembling hands. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. We processed the casualty reports that came in from Korea. Every day lists would arrive, names, ranks, service numbers, how they died, where they died. We had to verify the information, update the records, and then—" her voice broke. "And then we had to notify the families." The Marines around her had gone very still. "We typed the letters," Maggie continued, her eyes unfocused, seeing something from decades past. "The official notifications. Dear Mrs. Smith, we regret to inform you. Dear Mr. Johnson, it is with deep sadness." Over and over and over. Some days there were so many. The typewriters never stopped. The sound of those keys, I still hear it sometimes. Jake's hand tightened on her shoulder. He'd never heard his grandmother speak like this, her voice carrying the weight of unbearable memory. "How many?" Chen asked quietly. "How many letters did you process?" Maggie closed her eyes. "I don't know the exact number. Hundreds. Maybe more than 1,000 over 2 years. Every single one was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father, and we had to tell them. We had to be the ones to destroy their world." A female Marine in the crowd, a sergeant with multiple deployments, had tears streaming down her face. She knew. Anyone who'd ever done casualty affairs knew. It was the job that broke people. "The worst were the ones who died right before the armistice," Maggie continued, her voice barely audible now. "July 1953, the war was ending, everyone knew it, and men were still dying, still getting killed in the last hours, the last days, and we had to write those letters knowing that they'd almost made it. Almost." Chen's jaw clenched. He'd read about this, the final days of the Korean War when casualties mounted even as peace negotiations concluded. The cruelest kind of loss. The initials on your tattoo, Chen said. JRM, who was that? Maggie's hand moved to her shoulder, touching the faded letters through her dress. James Robert Mitchell, Private First Class. He was 19 years old, died at the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950 before I even enlisted. But I processed his final paperwork in 1953. There was a delay in recovering his remains. His file landed on my desk. She reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out an old watch. It was tarnished, the leather strap cracked and worn, the face frozen at 10:47. I wrote his mother a letter, the official one, but I added something personal. I told her that her son's sacrifice mattered, that we would never forget him, that his service honored her and his family. I wasn't supposed to do that. It wasn't protocol, but I couldn't just send the form letter. I couldn't. Maggie held up the watch, and Chen took it carefully, handling it like the sacred relic it was. 6 months after my discharge, I got a package. Mrs. Mitchell had found my address somehow. She sent me James's watch, the one he was wearing when he died, and she sent a letter thanking me. She said that in all the official notifications, mine was the only one that made her feel like her son was a person, not just a number. Chen examined the watch and he noticed something engraved on the back. To James from Mom, come home safe. He'd never come home, but his mother had sent his most precious possession to a young woman who'd honored his memory with a few kind words in a casualty letter. I've carried it every day since, Maggie whispered, every single day, as a reminder that every name on those lists was someone's James, someone's son, someone who mattered. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people. Some were crying openly. Others stood rigid, fighting to maintain composure. Jake was staring at his grandmother like he'd never seen her before. Because he hadn't, none of them had. Ma'am, Chen said carefully, did you ever receive recognition for your service? Any commendations, any acknowledgement? Maggie laughed bitterly. I got a discharge certificate and a handshake. Women weren't eligible for the GI Bill if we hadn't served overseas. I tried to join the VFW and was told women weren't welcome. I applied for veterans benefits and was told my service didn't qualify because I was only a clerk. Her voice hardened with decades of suppressed anger. Only a clerk, as if witnessing and honoring the dead was somehow less important than pulling a trigger, as if bearing that burden didn't cost something. Chen felt something shift in his chest. He'd been in command positions for years, had given hundreds of speeches about honor and sacrifice. But this woman, this tiny, elderly woman who'd been invisible for 70 years, had carried a burden that most Marines would break under. And she'd done it alone, without recognition, without support, without anyone even knowing. That ends today, Chen said firmly. He turned to Lieutenant Morrison. Get my commander's coin and contact public affairs. This story needs to be told. He looked back at Maggie, his voice softening. Marine Corporal Sullivan, you are seen. Your service is recognized, and every Marine here will remember what you did. Maggie looked up at him, tears still streaming down her weathered face, and whispered the words she'd longed to hear for 70 years. Thank you, sir. Lieutenant Morrison returned within 3 minutes, moving faster than Chen had ever seen him move. He carried the commander's coin in one hand and had his phone pressed to his ear with the other, already coordinating with public affairs. But Chen's mind was racing ahead. A coin wasn't enough. Not for this. Not for a woman who'd spent 70 years erased from history. He looked at Maggie, still sitting on the bench, Jake's arm around her shoulders, her weathered hands clutching James Mitchell's frozen watch. Around them, the crowd had swelled to over 100 people. New Marines, their families, drill instructors, officers. Word was spreading across the parade deck like wildfire. There's a woman Marine from Korea here, a real one from the war. Chen made a decision that would probably violate a dozen regulations. He didn't care. "Attention on deck," his command voice carried across the parade deck. Every Marine within earshot snapped to attention. The civilians looked around in confusion, but they sensed something important was happening. The murmur of conversation died instantly. Chen stood before them, straight-backed and commanding. "I need all Marines currently on this parade deck to form up, right here, right now, company formation." There was a moment of hesitation. This was highly irregular. The ceremony was over. Families were waiting. But when a commander gave an order, Marines obeyed. Within 60 seconds, over 200 Marines had formed into ranks. New graduates still in their dress blues, drill instructors in their campaign covers, officers, staff NCOs, all standing at attention. The families, sensing something extraordinary, grew quiet and moved to the sides. Chen gestured for Maggie to stand. She looked terrified, but Jake helped her to her feet. Her legs shook, but she stood straight, straighter than she had in years. "Marines," Chen's voice carried across the assembled formation. "Today was supposed to be about these new graduates earning their title, about them joining the Brotherhood of Marines that stretches back to 1775. But we have just discovered that we have been in the presence of that history all along, and we didn't know it." He gestured to Maggie. "This is Marine Corporal Margaret Sullivan. She served from 1952 to 1954 during the Korean War. She was stationed at Camp Pendleton in the casualty section, where she processed casualty reports and notifications for Marines killed in action." The weight of those words settled over the formation like a physical thing. Chen continued, his voice growing stronger. "For those of you who don't know, the casualty section is one of the hardest assignments in the Marine Corps. These Marines bear witness to every loss. They are the ones who must notify families that their loved ones are never coming home. It is a burden that breaks people, and Corporal Sullivan carried that burden for 2 years, during one of the most brutal conflicts in our nation's history." Several of the older Marines nodded. They knew. Some of them had done casualty affairs. They understood the cost. When Corporal Sullivan was discharged in 1954, she came home to a nation that didn't want to acknowledge her service. She was denied veterans' benefits, turned away from veterans' organizations, told that what she did didn't matter, so she hid her service. She hid her tattoo. She hid her pain. For 70 years. Maggie's shoulders were shaking. Jake held her tighter, his own face wet with tears. "She hid it so well that her own grandson," Chen gestured to Jake, a United States Marine who just graduated today, didn't know his grandmother had served. Didn't know she was one of the approximately 20,000 women who served during the Korean War. Didn't know she was a Marine. The formation was absolutely silent. Some of the new graduates were crying openly. One of the drill instructors, a grizzled gunnery sergeant with 23 years of service, removed his campaign cover and held it over his heart. Chen's voice dropped, becoming almost conversational, but it carried to every person present. "There's something we say in the Marine Corps, once a Marine, always a Marine. But for decades, we didn't live up to that promise for our women Marines. We forgot them. We erased them. We allowed them to disappear." He turned to face Maggie directly. "Corporal Sullivan, that ends today, right here, right now." Chen reached up and unpinned the ribbon from his own uniform, a Korean service medal, one he'd inherited from his uncle who'd served in Korea. His most treasured possession. "This belonged to my uncle, Corporal David Chen, who served in Korea in 1951. He died before I was born, but this medal has been in my family for 70 years. My father gave it to me when I earned my commission and told me to remember what it cost." Chen's hands were steady as he held the medal, but his voice was thick with emotion. "Corporal Sullivan, you earned this more than I ever did. You bore witness to men like my uncle. You honored their sacrifice. You carried their memory when the world wanted to forget." He stepped forward and carefully pinned the medal to Maggie's floral dress, right over her heart. The parade deck erupted. Not in cheers, that would have been inappropriate, but in applause that started with one Marine and spread through the entire formation like a wave. Then someone, no one would remember who, began to salute, and then another, and another. Within seconds, every Marine on that parade deck was standing at attention, rendering honors to a 78-year-old woman in a sweat-stained dress. Maggie looked out at the sea of salutes, 200 Marines honoring her, finally, after 70 years, and something inside her that had been broken began to heal. Her right arm rose in a return salute that was shaky but perfect. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath 7 decades of silence. "Semper Fi, Corporal," Chen said quietly, his own hand still at his brow. And Maggie, who hadn't spoken those words in 70 years, who had forbidden herself from claiming that identity, whispered back, "Semper Fideli, sir, always faithful." The applause grew louder. Families joined in, not fully understanding what they were witnessing but recognizing the sacredness of the moment. Jake stood beside his grandmother, tears streaming down his face, watching her finally receive the recognition she deserved for 7 decades. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer forgotten. She was a Marine. And everyone knew it. The applause finally faded, but the Marines remained in formation, unwilling to break ranks, as if doing so would somehow diminish the moment. Commander Chen stood beside Maggie, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then, from somewhere in the back of the formation, a voice began to sing. From the halls of Montezuma. It was a drill instructor, his voice strong and clear. Within 2 beats, the entire formation joined in. To the shores of Tripoli. 200 voices, singing the Marine Corps hymn, for a woman who'd never heard it sung in her honor. Maggie's knees buckled slightly, and Jake caught her, holding her upright as the hymn washed over them. "We fight our country's battles in the air, on land and sea." When the final notes faded, if the Army and the Navy ever look on heaven's scenes, they will find the streets are guarded by United States Marines. There wasn't a dry eye on the parade deck. Chen finally gave the order, "Dismissed." The formation broke, but the Marines didn't disperse. Instead, they moved toward Maggie, a slow, respectful approach like pilgrims to a shrine. A young female Marine from Jake's platoon was first. She stood at attention in front of Maggie, her voice shaking. "Ma'am, I just want to say thank you. My recruiter told me there were no women Marines before the 1970s. She was wrong, and I'm sorry. You were there first. You paved the way." Maggie reached out and touched the young woman's cheek. "What's your name, dear?" "Private First Class Sarah Chen, ma'am. No relation to the commander," she added with a small smile. "You're a Marine, Sarah. That makes you my sister. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong." Private Chen's face crumpled, and she snapped to attention, saluted, and walked away quickly, wiping her eyes. Others came forward. A gunnery sergeant who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, a young corporal who'd just returned from Okinawa, a retired master sergeant who'd been visiting his grandson's graduation and had 28 years of service. Each one thanked her, each one saluted, each one called her Marine. Lieutenant Morrison approached Chen quietly. "Sir, Public Affairs is here. They want to document this. Interview Corporal Sullivan, maybe do a story for the Marine Corps Times." Chen glanced at Maggie, who was surrounded by Marines, her face transformed from the frightened, exhausted woman of an hour ago into something radiant. "Ask her permission. If she says no, we respect that. This is her story to tell or not tell." But before Morrison could move, another figure pushed through the crowd. She was in her 60s, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, with silver hair cut in a short, practical style. She walked with a slight limp but carried herself with unmistakable authority. When she reached Maggie, she stopped and stared. 1952 to 1954, the woman asked, her voice rough. Maggie nodded, uncertain. The woman's eyes filled with tears. My mother served in the Women Marines, 1953 to 1955, Camp Lejeune. She died in 1987, and nobody ever acknowledged what she did. She went to her grave thinking it didn't matter. Maggie reached out and took the woman's hand. It mattered, she mattered, tell me her name. Dorothy Ann Harrison. Dorothy Ann Harrison was a Marine, Maggie said firmly. And her service mattered, I promise you that. The woman broke down, and Maggie pulled her into an embrace, two strangers connected by the invisible thread of forgotten service. Jake watched his grandmother, this woman he thought he knew, this quiet, ordinary grandmother who made him cookies and sent birthday cards, and realized he'd never known her at all. Or rather, he'd only known the part of her she'd been willing to show. Rodriguez appeared at Jake's elbow. Your grandmother is a certified badass, Sullivan. I had no idea, Jake said, his voice hollow. How could I not know? How could she hide this for my entire life? Because she had to, said a voice behind them. They turned to find an elderly African-American man wearing a Korean War veteran cap leaning on a cane. I served in Korea, 1952. When we came home, nobody wanted to hear about it. It was the forgotten war before it even ended. But for women, he shook his head. They had it worse. At least people believed we'd served. Women veterans were treated like they were making it up, like they were trying to steal valor from real veterans. He looked at Maggie with profound respect. Your grandmother survived that. She survived being erased. That takes strength most people don't have. Across the parade deck, Commander Chen was speaking with his public affairs officer, but his eyes never left Maggie. He made another decision. Get me a contact for the Women Marines Association, and the Korean War Veterans Association, and the National Personnel Records Center. I want Corporal Sullivan's service fully documented. I want her in the system. I want her records updated to reflect every benefit she was denied, and I want a letter of commendation for her service file. Morrison blinked. Sir, she's been retired for 70 years. I'm not sure we can. Find a way, Chen said flatly. She gave 2 years of her life to the Corps, and we gave her nothing but silence. That changes now. I don't care what regulations I have to navigate. Make it happen. Yes, sir. Chen walked back to Maggie, who was now sitting on the bench again, exhausted but smiling as Marines continued to approach her. He knelt beside her. Ma'am, I have a question for you. How many of the women you served with are still alive? Maggie's smile faded. I don't know, we lost touch. The Corps didn't maintain rosters for us like they did for the men. We just scattered, disappeared. Would you like to find them? Maggie's breath caught. Is that possible? I'm going to make it possible, Chen promised. You're not going to be invisible anymore. None of you are. Maggie grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Some of them might not want to be found. Some of them might have buried this deeper than I did. Then we'll respect that, Chen said. But they deserve the choice. They deserve to know that their service is finally being recognized, that they matter. Maggie looked around the parade deck, at the Marines who'd honored her, at her grandson who was seeing her for the first time, at the families who'd witnessed this unexpected ceremony within a ceremony. I spent 70 years being quiet, she said softly. I think I'm done being quiet. Chen smiled, Semper Fi Marine. Always faithful, Maggie whispered back. And for the first time in 7 decades, she believed it. The sun was setting over Paris Island, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when the parade deck finally began to clear. Maggie had spent 4 hours sitting on that bench, meeting Marines, sharing stories, and slowly piecing together the fragments of a life she'd tried to forget. Jake sat beside her, still in his dress blues, holding her hand. Neither of them had spoken in several minutes. There was too much to say and no words adequate enough to say it. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "Why didn't you ever tell us, Grandma? Not even a hint." Maggie stared at the Korean service medal pinned to her dress, touching it gently. "Because I was ashamed. Ashamed of serving your country. Ashamed that I let them erase me," Maggie said, her voice cracking. "I should have fought harder. I should have demanded recognition. But I was so tired, Jake. So tired of being told I didn't matter, that what I did wasn't real service. After a while, I started to believe it myself." She turned to look at her grandson, really look at him. "When you told me you were enlisting, I was terrified. Not because of the danger. I knew you could handle that. I was terrified because I knew what it felt like to give everything to something, only to have it not give anything back. I didn't want that for you." Jake's jaw tightened. "But it's different now. They just honored you, Commander Chen." "Commander Chen is one good man," Maggie interrupted gently. "But he's not the whole world. Things have changed, yes, but slowly, so slowly." She squeezed his hand. "I'm grateful for today, more grateful than I can express. But Jake, I want you to understand something important." She reached into her purse and pulled out James Mitchell's watch again, the one frozen at 10:47. "I didn't keep serving for recognition. I served because it mattered, because every name on those casualty lists was a person who deserved to be honored. Every letter I typed was a family that deserved truth and dignity in their darkest moment. The work was the honor. The service itself was the recognition." She pressed the watch into Jake's hands. "I was going to give this to you after graduation anyway. I want you to have it." "Grandma, I can't take this. It's too important." "Which is exactly why you should have it," Maggie said firmly. "James Robert Mitchell died at 19 years old, fighting in a frozen hell half a world away. His mother sent me this watch because she wanted someone to remember him. Well, I've remembered him for 70 years. Now it's your turn." Jake's hands trembled as he held the watch. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll remember that being a Marine isn't about the uniform or the ceremonies or the recognition. It's about service. It's about standing post, even when nobody's watching. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." Maggie's voice grew stronger. "I spent 70 years thinking my service didn't matter because nobody acknowledged it, but I was wrong. It mattered because of the work itself. Because every letter I wrote honored someone's sacrifice. Because every name I processed was treated with dignity. That's what being a Marine means. Not the applause, the service." Jake pulled his grandmother into his arms, and they held each other as the last light faded from the sky. Later that evening in Maggie's hotel room, Jake sat with her as she prepared for her flight home the next morning. His phone had been buzzing constantly. His mother, other family members, friends who'd somehow already heard what happened. The story was spreading. "Mom wants to know why you never told her," Jake said carefully. Maggie sighed. "Your mother was born in 1962. By then I'd been just a housewife for 8 years. How do you tell your child that you used to be someone completely different, that you once had a whole other life?" She smiled sadly. "So I didn't, and the longer I didn't, the harder it became." There was a knock at the door. Jake answered it to find Commander Chen standing in the hallway, now in his service uniform, holding a package. "I hope I'm not intruding," Chen said. "I wanted to give Corporal Sullivan something before she left tomorrow." Maggie stood surprised. "Commander, you've already given me more than." "Please, ma'am, let me do this." Chen handed her the package. Inside was a shadow box professionally made. In the center was a certificate ornately printed. "In recognition of Corporal Margaret Sullivan, USMC, who served with honor and distinction from 1950 to 1954, bearing witness to the fallen and honoring their sacrifice with dignity and compassion. Your service will never be forgotten. Semper Fidelis." Below the certificate was a place for the Women Marines emblem, her service dates, and a small brass plate that read, "Once a Marine, always a Marine." "I know it was rushed," Chen said, looking almost embarrassed. "If you'd like something different." Maggie couldn't speak. She traced the words with her finger, tears streaming down her face. "There's more," Chen continued. "I've contacted the Women Marines Association. They're working on tracking down other women who served during your time, and I've submitted paperwork to have your service formally recognized in the Veterans Registry. You'll receive a certificate and information about benefits you've been entitled to for 70 years. "I don't need benefits," Maggie whispered. "Maybe not," Chen said gently, "but you deserve them, and more importantly, you deserve to have your service on record, so that 70 years from now, when someone looks up the Korean War, your name is there. You're part of the history." Maggie looked up at him, this commander who'd given her back something she thought was lost forever. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Chen was quiet for a moment. "Because my uncle died in Korea. Someone like you processed his casualty report. Someone like you typed the letter that destroyed my grandmother's world. And whoever that person was, they did it with care, with dignity. My grandmother kept that letter until the day she died. It was her most precious possession because someone, some Marine she never met, had honored her son." He met Maggie's eyes. "Maybe it was you, maybe it wasn't, but it was someone like you. And I owe you, a debt I can never repay." The three of them stood in that small hotel room, connected by threads of service and sacrifice that stretched across decades. The next morning, Maggie boarded her plane home, but she wasn't the same woman who'd flown to South Carolina 2 days earlier. She wore the Women Marines t-shirt Jake had bought her proudly. When a flight attendant, a Navy veteran, saw it and offered her first-class seating, Maggie accepted with a smile. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," the attendant said. For the first time in 70 years, Maggie responded without hesitation. "It was my honor." As the plane climbed through the clouds, Maggie touched her left shoulder where the tattoo lay beneath the fabric. She'd spent 7 decades hiding it, ashamed of it, trying to pretend it didn't exist. "No more." She pulled out her phone, a recent concession to modern technology, and took a photograph of the shadow box on her lap. She sent it to her daughter with a simple message. "We need to talk. I have something to tell you about who I used to be." Within seconds her phone rang. Linda's voice was confused and concerned. "Mom, what is this? What's going on?" Maggie took a deep breath. "Sweetheart, did you know that your mother was a United States Marine?" Silence on the other end of the line. "Then what?" And for the first time in 70 years, Margaret Sullivan told her story. All of it. The enlistment, the service, the casualty reports, the typewriters that never stopped, the letters to mothers and widows, the erasure, the shame, the silence. And the tattoo she'd hidden for 7 decades. By the time the plane landed in Montana, Linda was crying. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't I know?" "Because I forgot who I was," Maggie said softly. "But your son reminded me. Jake reminded me that once a Marine, always a Marine, and I'm done pretending otherwise." When Maggie walked through her front door, she didn't put the shadow box in a closet or a drawer. She hung it on her living room wall, where everyone who entered would see it. A week later, she received a package from the Women Marines Association. Inside were photographs, newsletters, and a letter. "Dear Corporal Sullivan, we heard about what happened at Paris Island. You are not alone. There are 73 of us left from the Korean War era, and we've all been invisible for too long. We'd like to invite you to our reunion next spring. It's time we all came out of the shadows. Semper Fi." Maggie read the letter 3 times, then carefully placed it in the shadow box beside her certificate. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the silver-haired woman in the Women Marines t-shirt, at the faded tattoo now visible on her shoulder, at the pride in her eyes that had been missing for 7 decades. "Corporal Margaret Sullivan, United States Marine Corps," she said to her reflection. "Retired but never forgotten." And she smiled. because after 70 years of silence, she'd finally come home. The end.